Proposition 1A, discussion of the use of state bond funds. Yes, sir.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members. My name is Stepan Haitan. I'm a Deputy Attorney General assigned to the Finance Unit at the Attorney General's Office, and I've been counsel to the authority beginning with the process for AB 3034 and through the approval process by the voters of Proposition 1A. My objective for this presentation is to summarize for you how the Bond Act affects the physical attributes of the high-speed rail system and the timing and sequence. One thing to note is that most of the requirements under the Bond Act aren't merely funding strings. They are requirements applicable to the system generally, regardless of where a particular element was funded from. There are some exceptions to that, but for the most part, that is the case. First, I plan to present kind of two categories of requirements. One relates to the physical of the system, and the other relates to funding process and sequence of construction. Firstly, I want to talk about the stations. It's pretty simple. There's a limit of 24 stations that may be served by high-speed trains, and no stations between Merced and Gilroy. The trains must be electric passenger trains with revenue operating speeds of at least 200 miles per hour where conditions permit. Non-stop travel times are listed in the Bond Act. Couple of noteworthy items. There are no travel time requirements in the Bond Act for the Altamont corridor or the segments from LA to Anaheim to Irvine. And you'll also note that the second to last on that specified list is Inland Empire to LA. It doesn't specify a particular location in the Inland Empire, just that a travel time from Inland Empire to LA must be 30 minutes or less. Other characteristics listed are design characteristics are operating headway, 5 minutes or less, transition intermediate stations or bypass them. Along any corridor, a passenger cannot be required to change a train. The system must be pretty much seamless along each corridor. You have to try to follow existing transportation and utility corridors, place stations with access to other transportation, minimize sprawl, and effects on wildlife movement. Category of requirements relates to funding. These requirements don't necessarily affect the characteristics of the system, but they are going to affect the sequence in which the system is built. There are a couple of ways to look at it. One is that there are geographic portions that are affected by these requirements, and then there are particular tasks that are affected by these requirements. And these only apply to non-bond funds. They don't apply to other funding sources, but as you know, those sources will have their own requirements which need to be coordinated. There's a general limitation that the legislature must appropriate all proceeds of the bonds available to the system. Without an appropriation, they are not available. One thing I want to note here, the first rule I'm going to point out is actually the exception to the rules. I'm going to point it out first because that is kind of the stage you're in right now. There's essentially a seed money provision in the Bond Act for up to $675 million of proceeds, but only for certain tasks, planning and a limited set of capital costs, which are listed on the slide. I won't repeat them. They're essentially considered kind of preliminary type costs. The other funding requirements, other than the Phase 1 exception and the appropriation requirement, don't apply to the $675 million. First geographic requirement is the Phase 1 preference. Phase 1 is San Francisco Transbay Terminal to LA to Anaheim. The bond proceeds are restricted for use on that phase for capital costs, although planning costs on other corridors may be expended, unless the authority makes certain findings and, of course, the legislature appropriates. Other geographic construction requirements, again, subject to the Phase 1 preference, the selection priority is to be given to usable segments that have a lower bond funding requirement as compared to a total funding requirement. So essentially, there's a preference for using bond funds last if it could be allocated that way. Other criteria that need to be considered in selecting usable segments or corridors are listed, but they are not exclusive in the Bond Act. They're required, but not the entire universe of considerations. Another important limitation is that construction costs paid from bond proceeds can't exceed 50% of the total cost of a corridor or usable segment. Those are the geographic limitations. There are task limitations as well that apply across the system. First one is you can't use more than 10% proceeds for environmental studies, planning, and preliminary engineering. Before the initial appropriation request for bond money for capital costs on a corridor or usable segment, there's a condition that needs to be satisfied. Now, this is outside of your seed money, obviously. The condition is that the authority has to prepare a funding plan for review by certain entities. And the plan will essentially define its usable segment or corridor to which it relates. And there are enumerated requirements for the plan in the Bond Act. That, again, is a condition to the initial appropriation request. There's a similar funding plan requirement, though not exactly the same, for as a condition, a commitment of funds for construction and real property and equipment acquisition. That is also submitted for review by certain entities, but has an additional requirement that there be a finding by the Director of Finance before commitments can be entered into by the authority for those kinds of costs.